My name is Father Daniel Whitmore. For more than 20 years, I have served as a priest in St. Augustine Parish, a small yet devoted congregation nestled in the heart of New England. My days were filled with the rhythms of faith, offering counsel, baptizing the young, burying the old, and comforting the dying. I stood in the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about salvation, about God's love, about the importance of surrender. I believed in every word I spoke, or at least I thought I did. People often said I had a gift for guiding others, that my voice carried the weight of truth. I smiled at their kind words, nodding in humble gratitude, but deep down I wondered. I wondered if I truly lived the faith I professed, or if I had merely mastered the art of appearing devout. Faith, after all, had become my profession as much as my purpose. There were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when doubt gnawed at the edges of my certainty. Late at night, after visiting a dying parishioner, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions I dared not voice aloud. What if I had it all wrong? What if I had spent my life teaching others about a God I had never fully known? But morning always came, and with it, the demands of my role. I buried those thoughts beneath the weight of responsibility, of expectation, of duty. That evening had been like so many others. I had just left the home of Mrs. Petrov, an elderly woman from my congregation who had been sick for some time. Her hands, frail and thin, trembled as she reached for mine. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, carried a strength that defied her failing body. "You've done so much for us, Father." "God bless you," she murmured, her pale blue eyes filled with gratitude. I forced a smile, squeezing her hand gently. "It is God who blesses, not me," I said, though my voice felt hollow. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the last remnants of daylight fading into the horizon. I slid into my old sedan, the one that had carried me to baptisms, funerals, and everything in between. The engine hummed to life with a familiar rattle, a reminder of how many years had passed since I first took my vows. The streets were quiet, the town settling in for the night. I turned onto the winding road that led home, the trees lining the highway casting long shadows beneath the streetlights. My mind drifted, as it often did, to my upcoming sermon. Repentance, perhaps? Or the danger of complacency? Something to remind people that faith wasn't just ritual, it was surrender. But even as I formed the words in my mind, a nagging thought pressed against my consciousness. Do I believe what I preach? Or have I merely convinced myself that I do? I shook my head, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Doubt was dangerous. It was best left unspoken, buried beneath the work of ministry. And then, without warning, it happened. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the tires against the pavement had always been a comforting sound, a rhythm I had grown accustomed to during my late-night drives home. But that night, something felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, a heaviness pressing against my chest. The headlights caught through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. The trees stood like sentinels on either side, their branches swaying in the autumn wind. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. My mind was still tangled in thoughts of my sermon of Mrs. Petrov's frail hands, of the gnawing uncertainty I had tried so hard to ignore. Faith is surrender. Faith is trust. I had preached those words 1,000 times, but did I truly understand them? Then, without warning, a deafening pop. The steering wheel jerked violently in my hands. The car veered hard to the right. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fought to regain control, but the tires had lost their grip. Gravel sprayed up from the shoulder. The guardrail rushed toward me, a blur of cold steel. My foot slammed against the brake. Nothing. A sickening screech of metal. A violent jolt. The car lunged over the embankment. And then, weightlessness. The world flipped upside down. My body wrenched forward as the seatbelt bit into my chest. The windshield shattered, exploding into a storm of glass. My stomach twisted into knots as the car tumbled, rolling over itself like a lifeless toy. The sound, an unholy mix of crunching metal and splintering wood, filled the air, but it was distant, muffled, like I was slipping out of reality itself. Then impact. A force so brutal it felt like the breath had been punched from my soul. And suddenly cold. An icy rush of water surged through the broken windshield, swallowing me whole. I gasped, but there was no air, only liquid filling my lungs. My body convulsed against the suffocating grip of the river. The weight of the water pressed down on me, crushing, relentless. I tried to move, to free myself, but the seatbelt had locked, pinning me to the seat. My hands clawed at the buckle, fingers numb and trembling. It wouldn't budge. Panic exploded in my chest. No! No, no, no! I yanked at the belt, twisting, thrashing, but the river was merciless. The freezing water crept higher, first my waist, then my chest, then my neck. My breath turned to mist in the frigid air as my mind screamed for survival. The door handle, I reached for it, but my fingers slipped against the slick metal. Locked. I fumbled for the window switch. Nothing. The electrics had died. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out the chaos. My lungs burned, demanding air that didn't exist. The weight of the water bore down on me like a living thing, pressing, squeezing, stealing every last ounce of strength I had left. This can't be it. This can't be how it ends. Desperation clawed at my throat. I fought, I struggled, but the river didn't care. It rushed in faster, hungrily filling every crevice of the wreckage. I was losing. God, please! I didn't even know what I was asking for. A miracle? A second chance? Or maybe just an answer? But there was no time. No time to think. No time to pray. No time for anything but the crushing finality of what was coming next. My vision blurred, the world around me dimming into darkness. My hands, once frantic, slowed. My body, once tense with terror, weakened. And then, nothing. The struggle ceased. A strange calm settled over me. The panic, the pain, the desperate need for air, all of it faded, replaced by a silence so absolute, so eerie, that it almost felt peaceful. And as my body surrendered to the abyss, as the river wrapped itself around me like a shroud, a final, chilling thought echoed through my mind. So this is death. I should have been dead. The river had taken everything, the air from my lungs, the warmth from my body, the strength from my limbs. I had felt the life being squeezed out of me, my last breath slipping away into the void. I had surrendered, fully expecting to slip into oblivion. But then, I opened my eyes, and I was somewhere else. There was no water, no crushing darkness, no icy hands of death pulling me down. Instead, I was surrounded by light. Not the harsh, blinding kind, but something pure, something alive. It was everywhere, around me, within me, as if the very air itself radiated a warmth that I had never known before. It wasn't coming from a single source, but rather it was the space itself, an all-encompassing glow that defied explanation. I blinked, expecting my vision to be blurry, my body to ache from the trauma, but nothing. I felt whole, lighter than I had ever felt before. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see them trembling, bruised from the crash, but they weren't. They were different. There were no wrinkles, no signs of age, no scars. My body, if I even had one, was weightless, free from the heaviness I had carried for so many years. I should have felt relief. I should have felt peace. Instead, panic gripped me. Where am I? My voice, was it even my voice, rang out, but there was no echo, no sound bouncing back from walls unseen. It was as if my words had been swallowed by the very atmosphere itself. Then, a presence. I felt it before I saw it. A knowing. A warmth so powerful, so overwhelming, that it wrapped around me like an embrace without ever touching me. It wasn't a voice. Not at first. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain, like the very essence of love itself had taken form and surrounded me. And in that moment, I knew. I was dead. The realization didn't come as a shock, nor did it bring the terror I had felt in the river. It was simply truth. An undeniable, inescapable truth that settled into my soul like it had been waiting there all along. Then I saw him. At first, he was distant, standing in the vastness of that endless light. But I recognized him instantly. Not from paintings, not from stories, not from anything that my earthly mind had ever been taught. I knew him because my soul had always known him. Jesus. He didn't need to speak. His eyes held everything, every answer, every question, every longing I had ever buried deep within myself. And in that instant, I felt everything. Every failure. Every sin. Every time I had preached about him, but failed to truly listen to him. Every moment I had judged instead of loved. Every prayer spoken out of obligation rather than devotion. It was all there, laid bare between us. I wanted to speak, to explain, to justify myself, to do something. But I couldn't. Not because I was frozen. Not because I was afraid. But because I knew nothing I could say would change what he already knew. He wasn't looking at my words. He wasn't looking at my actions. He was looking straight into my heart. And the weight of it was unbearable. Not because he was condemning me, but because he wasn't. There was no anger, no disappointment, only sadness. A sadness so deep, so overwhelming, that it pierced through me more than any judgment ever could. I had spent my life thinking I was serving him, preaching his word, leading his people. But had I truly known him? Had I loved him the way he had loved me? His eyes held something beyond sorrow, a love so vast, so consuming, that it made my own understanding of love seem like nothing more than a flickering candle in the face of the sun. Then he spoke, not with his lips, not with sound, but with something deeper. A voice that didn't just reach my ears, it reached my soul. Come! I didn't question it. The moment I moved, if moving was even the right word, the endless light faded, and something new took its place. I was standing on solid ground, yet it didn't feel like earth. The air itself felt different, thick with something more than just atmosphere. It was alive, charged with an energy I had never known. Before me stretched a city, if it could even be called that. There were no buildings as I had known them, no towering glass structures, no roads cluttered with signs. And yet, it was unmistakably a city, vast and golden, shimmering as if it was made of light itself. Everything here glowed, not from an outside source, but from within, as if existence itself radiated pure life. The air hummed, but not with noise. It wasn't sound in the way I had always understood it. It was something deeper, a vibration that resonated through me, a song of worship that wasn't just heard, it was felt. And it came from everything. Then I saw them. People. Not crowds, not chaos, but multitudes, each one radiant with a peace that was undeniable. They weren't ghosts. They weren't mere spirits. They were real. More real than anything I had ever seen. Their faces were filled with joy, with purpose, with an understanding that I could not yet grasp. Some turned toward me, their eyes filled with warmth. Some nodded. Some simply continued what they were doing, if doing was even the right word. There was no hurry, no worry, only being. And then I felt him beside me. Jesus walked in silence, leading me forward. I wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the questions didn't matter. Not yet. This place, it was what was meant for us. Not just for me. Not just for the people I saw here. For everyone. This was what he had intended from the very beginning. A life beyond death. Beyond pain. Beyond fear. But not everyone was here. And the thought hit me like a weight heavier than anything I had ever carried. I turned to him, my lips parting, but I didn't need to ask. He already knew the question burning in my mind. And in his eyes, I saw it. Sorrow. Deep, immeasurable sorrow. They have forgotten me, he said. I didn't understand. Not at first. Churches were full. People still prayed. Millions still believed. But then he showed me. And what I saw shattered me. I saw churches, grand and towering, their stained glass windows glowing with the colors of saints. I saw modern auditoriums filled with thousands, lights flashing, voices singing in unison. I saw small village chapels, simple yet full of reverence. Churches of every kind. And yet, something was missing. At first, I couldn't see it. The people were there. They were worshiping, singing, listening to sermons. They raised their hands, bowed their heads, took communion. Everything looked right. But Jesus didn't look at the buildings. He didn't look at the crowds. He looked deeper. "They speak of me," he said, his voice heavy. "But do they know me?" And then I saw it. In so many of these churches, there was a hollowness, a lack of him. The worship was routine. The prayers were rehearsed. The sermons were polished, well-crafted, designed to inspire, but empty. More concerned with motivation than truth. More concerned with pleasing than saving. I saw preachers standing on stages, their words powerful, their voices commanding, but their messages hollow. They stirred emotions, but not spirits. They entertained, but they did not transform. And the people, they left feeling uplifted, but unchanged. They treated faith like a habit, a duty, something to check off before returning to their real lives. And worst of all, they didn't even realize it. Jesus turned to me. His eyes, so full of love, now held a weight that was unbearable. "You must tell them." The words struck like thunder. Tell them? Tell them what? How could I possibly make people see what I was seeing? How could I convince them that they had lost him when they still gathered in his name? But before I could even protest, his expression did not change. I stood there, my soul trembling under the weight of what I had seen. The beauty of heaven still surrounded me, but it was no longer enough to silence the agony rising in my chest. I had thought that coming face to face with Jesus would bring nothing but peace, yet here I was, burdened by a sorrow deeper than any I had ever known. "They have forgotten me," he had said. And now I understood. I saw it all, the rituals without reverence, the prayers without passion, the faith without surrender. I saw preachers who once carried the truth now bending it to fit the desires of the world. I saw worship turn into performance, sermons designed to entertain rather than convict. I saw churches filled with people who claimed to know him, yet their hearts were far from him. I saw myself. The pulpit where I had stood so many times, preaching words I thought were full of truth. But how often had I spoken from habit rather than from a place of true communion with him? How often had I focused more on the expectations of my congregation than on leading them to Christ? How many times had I preached about surrender without fully surrendering myself? The weight of it was suffocating. I fell to my knees, my hands gripping the ground beneath me, if it was even ground at all. It felt too solid, too alive, to be anything of this world. My voice trembled as I spoke, though the words barely formed. "Lord, I thought I was serving you." Jesus knelt beside me, his presence overwhelming yet so full of love it made my heart ache. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not as a judge, but as a father. "I never wanted religion," he said softly. "I wanted them." Tears burned my eyes. I had spent my life building a church, tending to traditions, guiding my congregation through rituals passed down for generations. But had I guided them to him? Had I truly led them to know him, or had I merely led them to believe in him from a distance? "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name?'" His voice was both sorrowful and firm. "And I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you.'" The word struck like a blade, cutting through every illusion I had held about my faith. This was real. This was urgent. I had spent decades believing I was leading others towards salvation, yet standing before him now, I realized how easily even I had been deceived. Jesus stood, his eyes full of both love and urgency. "Will you tell them?" he asked. And in that moment, I knew. I had no choice. I had to go back. My eyes snapped open. A violent gasp tore through my chest, my lungs convulsing as they sucked in air, real air. Cold, wet, earthly. The weight of my body returned all at once, heavy and aching. My limbs trembled, my head pounded, my vision blurred. And yet, through the overwhelming flood of sensation, only one truth burned in my mind. "Jesus is God!" The words burst from my throat, raw and unfiltered, carrying the force of everything I had seen, everything I had felt. My voice echoed into the night, carried by the wind, swallowed by the sound of rushing water beside me. I was back. The golden city was gone. The music of heaven, the light that had wrapped around me, the presence of Christ himself, gone. In its place was the frigid darkness of the riverbank, my body sprawled across the damp earth, my breath ragged. I coughed violently, my chest heaving as my body fought to make sense of its return. Water spewed from my mouth, my muscles spasming as I tried to push myself up. My hands dug into the mud, trembling with the effort. I was soaked, freezing, and yet, beneath the shock of it all, a fire raged inside of me, something beyond the physical, beyond the mortal. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. And now, somehow, I was here. I pressed a shaking hand against my chest, feeling the frantic pounding of my heart. Every beat was a reminder I was alive. But why? The answer came before I could even ask. "You must tell them." Jesus' words still echoed in my soul, heavier now, louder. The weight of his sorrow, the urgency of his voice, pressed into me like an iron brand. I had seen what so few had. I had stood in the presence of truth itself. And I had been sent back. A sharp gust of wind cut through my drenched clothing, but I barely noticed. I struggled to my knees, my body weak but my spirit alive. I turned my gaze upward, staring at the vast expanse of the night sky. The stars blinked indifferently above me, unaware of the miracle that had just taken place. Tears welled in my eyes, though I couldn't tell if they were from the cold, from exhaustion, or from the sheer magnitude of what had happened. "Why, Lord?" My voice was barely above a whisper now, trembling. "Why did you send me back?" But I already knew. This wasn't just for me. It wasn't just a vision to carry in my heart. It was a message. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every movement felt foreign, as if I had forgotten how to exist in this world. My hands clenched at my sides, not in anger, but in determination. I had to tell them. The world needed to know. I sat in the hospital bed, staring at my hands. They looked the same, calloused, weathered with time, veins just visible beneath the thin skin. But they weren't the same. Nothing was. I wasn't the man who had driven down that dark, winding road. I wasn't the priest who had spent years speaking of faith while secretly fearing his own lack of it. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen what awaited beyond this life. And yet, here I was. A machine beat steadily beside me, monitoring my heart as if it could measure the immensity of what had happened. My body ached, sore from the crash, but my soul burned with something deeper than pain. Something more powerful than fear. "You must tell them!" His words haunted me, pressing into my chest like a weight I could never set down. I had to speak. I had to tell them. But who would believe me? My wife entered first, her face pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying. The relief in her expression was almost enough to crush me. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice shaking as she rushed to my side, gripping my hands like she was afraid I'd vanish again. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I died," I croaked, the words tasting foreign, unreal. "I saw him." "I saw Jesus." She blinked, her grip loosening just slightly. "Daniel, you—" "I was dead," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. "I saw heaven. I saw the truth." She stared at me, searching my face for something, an explanation, a sign that I had hit my head too hard, that this was nothing more than a hallucination. My eldest son, Mark, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My brother, Matthew, scoffed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "You almost drowned," he said, shaking his head. "You were probably hallucinating." I clenched my fists. "No." I was there. I saw him. The silence in the room thickened. My wife swallowed, her eyes flickering with worry. "Daniel," she said softly, "you went through something traumatic." "Maybe your mind?" "No," I said, firmer now. "You don't understand. I wasn't just unconscious. I was gone. And he sent me back. He showed me what's happening to the church. To all of us." My brother let out a slow breath, glancing away. Mark shifted on his feet, looking anywhere but at me. My wife squeezed my hand, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. They didn't believe me. Not completely. They were relieved that I was alive, grateful that I had survived, but the truth I carried was too much, too impossible. I had spent my life preaching about heaven, about faith, about Christ. And now, when I had seen him with my own eyes, they doubted me. It stung more than I cared to admit. The doctors called it a miracle. Hypothermia should have set in. I should have drowned. By all logic, I should not be here. Yet none of that mattered if no one was willing to listen. But I couldn't stay silent. The following Sunday, I stood before my congregation. My body was weak, my spirit anything but. They had prayed for me, said messages of concern. They expected a sermon about gratitude, about the power of God's mercy. But what I had to say was far more than that. I stepped up to the pulpit, gripping the edges tightly. I looked out at the familiar faces, some filled with warmth, others with skepticism. Some were faithful, some were doubters, some were simply there because it was routine. I had preached to them for years, but never like this. "I died," I said. A hush fell over the room. Some leaned in, intrigued. Others stiffened in their seats, uncomfortable. I could hear the shuffling of feet, the quiet murmurs passing between those who thought they already knew where this was going. "I was in my car," I continued, my voice steady. "The water was rising. I couldn't breathe. And then I wasn't there anymore. I told them everything. The crash, the cold grip of the river, the suffocating darkness, the moment my soul slipped from my body and into the light. I told them about him, about the way his presence consumed me, saw through me, knew me in ways I had never known myself, about the sorrow in his eyes, about his warning. I told them what he had shown me. The church is filled with people, but empty of spirit. The preachers who spoke, but never led. The worship that was more performance than surrender. And then I asked them, "Do you know him? Or do you just know about him?" The weight of the question settled over them like a stone dropped into deep water. Some lowered their eyes. A woman in the front row wiped at her tears. A man folded his arms tightly, lips pressed into a thin line. But some just looked uncomfortable. They didn't want to hear this. Some of them would dismiss me, say I had imagined it, say I had misinterpreted what had happened. Some would walk away, unwilling to wrestle with the truth that had been placed before them. But I had to speak. I had to warn them, because Jesus had sent me back. And whether they believed me or not, I would not be silent. Not everyone believed me. I knew they wouldn't. When I stood before my congregation and told them what I had seen, what he had shown me, some leaned forward in their pews, eyes wide with wonder. Others shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking toward the exits, as if contemplating an escape. And then there were those who refused to meet my eyes at all. I could almost hear their thoughts. He's lost his mind. The accident did something to him. He's imagining things. But I didn't care. I had been dead. I had stood before Jesus Christ himself. He had sent me back. And whether they believed me or not, I had to speak. After the service, a few people approached, hesitantly at first. An older woman, Mrs. Callahan, who had attended my church for years, gripped my hands, her fingers trembling. "I believe you, Father," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. I don't know why, but I do." Her voice cracked, as if she were afraid to say the words too loudly, afraid of being judged for believing in something so impossible. A younger man, David, nodded from behind her. "Me too," he admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel it in my soul." "What you're saying, it feels true." I squeezed her hands and looked at them both. "It is true," I said, my voice steady. "Jesus is real. Heaven is real. And he's calling us back to him." But for every person who leaned in, desperate to hear more, there were others who walked past me, offering only forced smiles and empty nods. Some barely concealed their skepticism. Others weren't so polite. One man, a longtime member of the church, scoffed as he walked by. "You expect us to believe you went to heaven and just waltzed back?" He shook his head. "Sounds like a near-death hallucination to me." His wife tugged at his arm, whispering for him to lower his voice, but he didn't. "I don't doubt you believe what you saw, Father, but that doesn't make it real." I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince him. I knew what I had seen. And I also knew this truth wasn't meant for those who refused to hear it. It was for those whose souls were already crying out for something more. So I kept speaking. not just from the pulpit, but everywhere. Word spread quickly. Some came out of curiosity, others out of mockery. But more than I ever expected came because something inside them ached for what I had to say. I started receiving letters, emails, phone calls from people I had never met. Some shared their own stories, experiences they had never dared to speak of before. Others asked questions, their voices filled with uncertainty, longing, hope. A woman from Ohio wrote, "I've always believed in God, but I've never felt Him." What you described, that longing, that distance, I feel it. How do I know Him the way you did? A retired pastor from Texas called me late one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "I've preached for 40 years, he admitted, "but I don't think I've ever truly known Him. I've known about Him. I've taught about Him. But I don't know if I've ever surrendered." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "It's not too late," I told him. "That's why He sent me back. He's calling us all to return to Him." Somewhere on the other end of the line, the man let out a heavy breath. "Then tell me what I need to do." And I did. I told him what Jesus had shown me. That faith isn't a ritual, it's a relationship. That salvation isn't about memorizing scripture or following traditions. It's about knowing Him. That belief alone isn't enough. Surrender is what He asks for. That our churches, our sermons, our songs mean nothing if our hearts are far from Him. It was happening. The message was spreading. And I knew this was only the beginning. One night, as I sat in my study, staring at the words I had written down from my experience, I felt a familiar warmth fill the room. Not heat, not a presence I could see, but something undeniable. I bowed my head, my hands trembling. "Lord, I am yours. Whatever you ask, I will do." And in the silence, I felt His answer. "Then keep speaking." I had no choice. I would keep speaking. I would keep telling them. Because time was short. And Jesus was still calling. Top of form. Bottom of form. I was a man of faith. At least, that's what I had always believed. I had spent years preaching about God, about heaven, about surrendering to Christ. But it wasn't until I died that I understood what it meant to know Him. When my car veered off the road that night, I thought it was the end. The icy grip of the river pulled me under, and in that moment, I felt nothing but terror. But death was not the end, it was the beginning. I stood before Jesus Himself. I saw His eyes, filled with love and sorrow. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Many of us claim to know Him, but do we truly surrender? Do we live for Him, or do we just go through the motions? He showed me the world as He sees it. Churches full of people but empty of spirit, prayers spoken without feeling, faith that is comfortable but not transformative. He sent me back with a message: return to me. Not to rituals, not to religion, but to Him. Now I ask you, if you had seen what I saw, how would you feel? Would your faith remain the same, or would you wake up? I invite you to take a step closer to Christ today. If this message has touched your heart, leave your prayer in the comments below. I will personally pray for you. Let's build a community of believers who seek Him not just in word, but in truth. If you believe this message needs to be heard, like, subscribe, and share this video. Someone out there needs this just as much as you did. Let's spread the truth before it's too late.